Hey, friends, welcome back to the Christian Heritage Podcast. It's just me and Roy this time. No special guest this week. Roy, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. It was kind of funny right before we came and started, recording. We just like, hey, you still owe me, Roy, a lunch and talk about the big idea. I'm like, dude, I don't even know what that big idea was. So you and I have been like two ships passing in the night a little
Yep.
bit when it comes to all of the activity happening here at Christian Heritage. So it's good to see you, James.
Yeah, a lot's been going on. A couple weeks ago, we had our Becoming a Trauma Responsive Community training at the chapel, the Lutheran Chapel,
Yeah, that's right.
near the University of Nebraska Lincoln campus. Had a few churches partner, a few Lutheran churches partner to make that happen, and had a pretty good turnout. And those families are, taking the first step to be trauma responsive and serve people in our community. And since then, it's just been go, go, go.
It has been. By the way, that was a great. I was so encouraged by that. To be honest, I mean, just processing with you, but that was such a great event to see those in our community and our churches who want to actively engage with becoming more trauma informed. What's that look like? Not only just on a personal level, but what does this look like on a church level? Which I think again, at some level, is setting up our topic for the day about this work that we're doing as we're engaging, having conversations with those locally about what does it really mean to become trauma informed, which is going to get into, I think, our topic today.
Agree. Yeah. So today we're talking about trauma, human flourishing, and discipleship. We've talked a lot about trauma this season and really some practical ways you can grow in understanding trauma, tools and tips to help you be trauma informed and responsive, how you enter into those hard situations wherever you're at in life. And today we're going to kind of take a step back. We're going to look at the 30,000 foot view of trauma through the lens of discipleship. And Roy, as I was crafting the notes for this, I was struggling to actually figure out what question it is we want to answer. And so I kind of have a couple questions to frame our time. One would be, how does entering into trauma impact our discipleship? Or to maybe put it differently, what does discipleship have to do with helping people heal from trauma? But where we could start is defining discipleship. And I'll kick us off here. When I was in seminary, I had to write papers on discipleship. And so I had very nerdy academic theological definitions of disciple. I mean, long, like we all did. You could not remember these definitions because they were so long. But then as I've hopefully matured a little bit and grown and served in churches, my wife and I served in campus ministry where what we did was discipleship. I really kind of narrowed it down to a really simple definition, and it's following Jesus with other people. I think we can get really individual with discipleship, but the fact is Jesus had a group of people with him who were literally following him around. I also like to define it as kind of friendship in a Christward direction. Like Roy and I bond, you and I bond over sports. We text a lot on the weekends at night when we're up late watching those crazy Pac-12 football games, right? And it's like, that's great. Roy and I are both Christians, but maybe we don't go in a Christward direction together. You can have Christians who are friends, but discipleship is when friends are when people are your friends and you're moving toward Jesus together. That's one way I like to think of discipleship. So friendship in a Christward direction. I'd love to hear what you think in terms of defining discipleship, and we'll get into trauma and human flourishing and what does discipleship have to do with that? But if we don't know what discipleship is, we're going to be starting from the wrong place. So that's my best attempt. Those two ideas. How have you defined discipleship, Roy? How do you think about it?
Probably like you, it has evolved from my understandings of being raised in the church in the 80s. And throughout, I think the church is defined that very differently as well. Where discipleship came really special for me, and I didn't really know that I had such a heart for it was until camp ministry. And working at camp at Monadnock, for 6 years. It was in New Hampshire. Man, that redefined my understanding of discipleship,
Mm,
and the importance of, um, I'm going to oversimplify it, but it really is about, for me, discipleship is about being known, um, in the context of my relationship with Christ.
yep.
And how do I invite others into that space? So it's
Yeah.
not just for me to
Yep.
be authentic in my own journey, my own faith journey, but it's helping others be safe and to be known in their faith journey. And camp provided incredible
I like that.
shared experiences around that. And not just for the camper. This is where discipleship became really, really special for me, is actually our summer staff.
Mm,
The staff who became a part of the camp family a little bit, and the development and growth towards a deeper understanding of who Jesus Christ is. That's not achieved in a Sunday morning service. It's
yeah.
really achieved in the ebbs and flows, the highs and lows of the day-to-day interactions. And at camp, when you're experiencing all of those things together, it became a very, very special experience. I would think not just for me, because it's not a one-way. Discipleship isn't one way. It
Yep.
was a two-way street of,
Yep.
not only were they learning from me and our staff, our full-time staff, but we were learning from them and understanding
Yeah.
the importance of faith. So, not to oversimplify that, but for me, it really is about me authentically letting others into my world
Yep.
through that lens of Christ, and then vice versa. It's that two-way relationship.
I think though that the simple is good. I mean, we could say following Jesus isn't easy. It's pretty hard,
Sure.
but it's not complicated.
It's
It's
not.
pretty
You're right.
simple,
You're right.
right?
You're right.
Um, Jesus said, the the way to following him is straight and narrow.
Mhm.
It is hard work to um, to continue to persevere. But what Jesus calls us to do is, I mean, he summed it up. He's like, hey, love God, love your neighbor. And that's essentially what you're talking about is I have this connection to Jesus and now I'm connected to others. And we love each other in these contexts that we're in together, and that in your situation, camp, right? So
Yep.
I don't think it's super complicated, but we make it complicated.
We do.
Something I read yesterday is what really sparked the desire to have the conversation here on our podcast. If you don't listen to the Lectio 365 app, Roy and I have used that for a while now, probably more than a year. And yesterday's prayer was particularly insightful. And it actually comes from a guy named Pete Portal, who I found out is South African. So that's pretty cool. I lived there once upon a time.
Hmm.
But here's the quote. He said, I once had a conversation with a wise old woman about my desire for our church to gain influence. And I think you could insert ministry, Christian organization,
Right.
nonprofit, whatever, to reach more people, change many more lives. She interrupted me, shaking her head. No, 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 she said. Be careful. More isn't always a sign of growth. You can grow in influence, have lots of people, more money, more buildings, but if you haven't grown in the presence of Jesus among you and in his love for the poor, then what you're talking about isn't healthy growth at all. It's just swelling. And swelling is what happens when something is infected or broken. And so I think it's really easy to slip into this. Discipleship means growth because that's true, but we equate growth with more or bigger or better. And so this idea of swelling has like haunted me for the last 24 hours. And so here's the question: beyond trauma informed, trauma responsive, just still big picture, is our discipleship, the church's discipleship, is it infected? Is it broken? We love the church. We wouldn't be talking about this if we didn't.
Right.
This isn't to throw shade on any one church or person or denomination. It's a capital C thing. Is our discipleship here in North America infected? Is it broken?
Yes.
You're the CEO. I'm going to let you answer.
Yeah, no. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
We've talked about this.
Yep.
When we look at just straight up data, and there's a lot of data that would substantiate, do I believe the church's discipleship is infected or broken? Yes.
Yep.
So when I look at Generation Z and you look at, faith transmission in and of itself, Look at Gen Z's love of God's word.
Mhm.
You look at their understanding of the inerrancy of scripture. When you look at just that data alone, it's alarming.
Yep.
You see that in the colleges, you're seeing that in the seminaries. So you're seeing this as one scope of data that would support that. The other part of that, I think, is, I've talked about this, is the important role that families play in discipleship.
Yep.
The hand my kids off to the youth group leader
Mm.
is at some level is not a model that is showing from an outcome perspective that kids are growing and thriving in their faith. So we'll go back to Vern Benston's study, Faith and Families, that came out about 10 years ago, and really looking at that mom and dad are their children's number one pastor.
Yep.
They're the greatest influence on their child's faith. But when you think about how most churches are organized in structure, it doesn't bring the family together. It actually separates the family out. And so we don't emphasize the important role that mom and dad play in the transmission of faith with their own children. And so those are just 2 points, I think, that would substantiate that some level our understanding of discipleship needs a radical overhaul, and why it is about swelling than it is about flourishing. And I think that ultimately is going to get at the heart of our conversation, is what does really flourishing look like in discipleship?
Yeah. In our last episode with Amber, she kind of made this, it was a joke, like, oh, when my kids were younger, they said, "Oh, mom, you talked so much." And we kind of laughed about it, and so much talking, but we know Amber, and we know that what she was also doing was modeling. She wasn't just talking. And so then in our conversation with her, we went on a little bit and talked about the importance of modeling. And you're getting at it right there, saying mom and dad are so important, not just because they talk a lot, but because they model their faith. And I think in a previous episode, correct me if I'm wrong, we discussed the importance of, it doesn't really matter what you say if your behavior is different and contradictory. And when I think about discipleship, like, Jesus didn't just go say, "Hey, go out and preach good sermons like me." He's like, go do what I did. Go love people, go touch people, go heal people. Literally do what I have been doing and I've taught you to do. Well, and that really gets at the heart of, I think, the infection or the brokenness that we're seeing is because so much of discipleship in our North American context has become, what can I put into my brain from a teacher, a pastor, a book, a Bible study guide? And those are not bad. Like, they're not bad things, but it's insufficient. It's incomplete.
Absolutely agree. So again, I think you look at Paul's writing, and most of he's like, look at how we have lived, look at what we have modeled for you. Now go do, right? So again, that's getting it to the heart of discipleship. Discipleship is about modeling what an active, vibrant faith looks like. And again, back to faith transmission, and we think about discipleship, the key aspect of discipleship has to happen in the home. It has to happen in the home. That is the front line when it comes to faith transmission. It is not what necessarily happens in a Sunday morning service, and not to diminish that, right? We will get really upset about the important role that plays. It plays a very important role. But again, if that's just happening for 90 minutes once a week, and you feel like that is going to be adequate enough for your children and for your grandchildren someday to believe what you believe, it's actually what you do outside of that 90-minute service that is actually going to have the greatest influence on your children. It's how you resolve conflict. It's how you express and show love. And this is, again, everything we've been talking about this season has been around TBRI, felt safety, emotional warmth and connection. That's discipleship. That is discipleship. And I think we have to make that shift in our mind about that. And I think that gets back to Deuteronomy 6:2 is, I have to love the Lord my God with all of my heart, strength, and soul. I can't give or impress these things upon my children if I don't have it. So I can't give what I don't have. This is true about discipleship. But again, it goes beyond. This is where all things lead back to the church, is you have to model that. You've got to preach that. You've got to provide the right programming to support those efforts, not pull away from that. And I think that's what the church has to ultimately own.
Agree.
Another thing, one of the things is we talked about, by the way, I love Lectio 365. If you're not, as an app, when it talks about just really nurturing the right, your own spiritual health. You and I've loved Lectio 365. I was really struck by this comment as well about, his understanding about what growth looks like. And in terms of church influence. I actually asked you to listen to a very popular national radio show, and I won't say what it was. And there were some things that really encouraged me about listening to the radio show, but there were some things that really made me cringe. And I think it goes in line with what Pete was talking about. As soon as we start talking about impacting our communities, we quickly shift to serving more people, building new buildings, raising more money. The statement was made, where there's vision, the money will follow. And by the way, I agree with every aspect that happens. But if we're strictly looking at growth in numbers as by which we value our impact and discipleship, then we're completely missing the point. I think it becomes what we're building, our own kingdom building, versus us advancing the kingdom, which is go and make disciples. So there is a depth to which, understanding human flourishing really should be, by the way, the goal of discipleship. It's not growth of numbers, it's growth of understanding the long-term faith impact that we want to build within, our current people that we're serving, but the generational impact that will have. That's the growth. The growth might not be immediately today, but it is for the generational impact of then how we do that. So I think we have to reframe what we believe about what success looks like, what influence looks like, and really having the long game in mind, not that short term, what might look good on a P&L sheet, or, your numbers of people sitting in your pews. I think those are inaccurate things to be judging your success.
I mean, when you look at the examples of Jesus's parables, right? I think there's actually a really good reason. Maybe I'll be able to ask God this question when I meet him. There's a really good reason Jesus came at a particular time and place when their culture was agricultural in nature and nothing was instant. Everything was slow.
Absolutely.
Almost all of his parables had to do with growing things and being patient, and it takes time. And I really think that if Jesus would have come today, we'd be like, well, I got an app for that. It goes up to space, it comes right back down. I can text someone in Japan and they get it immediately.
Right.
But back then that wasn't the case, right?
Agreed.
So mustard seed takes time. There's no greenhouse, GMO factory where you can produce a mustard seed in a full tree in 6 months. No, it's going to take time.
Well, and we've wrestled, right.
The organic nature of discipleship lends well to that. It takes time.
Right. And we've wrestled with that here at Christian Heritage. When we've talked about what ultimately is going to define Christian Heritage, it is not defined by how many kids we're serving. It really comes down to children well-being and flourishing. Yep. And we're in a field, by the way, that when kids age out of the system, we are monumentally failing children within the foster care system. Kids aging out, right? 70%, their future is prison, it's human trafficking, it's homelessness. Like we can do so much better. And I think so what we've resolved as an organization, and we've had so many conversations about that, is we're not okay with that. Yep. So what do we need to significantly to do that? And by the way, that's not a fault on, the incredible people that work in this field. There are many people that give everything to help children and families in the midst of this. But what we've said is not how do we grow our numbers. We're talking about, can we reduce that 70% for kids who come in and through, the Christian homes, the organization that we're running, is what's it going to require of us to see children flourish? That's the long game for us, because right, the high percentages, if we don't do that, then those kids that we have served, then their kids are going to end up back in the system, and then their grandkids are going to end up, like, at some point, when do we sever that? And I think that's the point that we have wrestled with this as well. And we want better well-being. We want better outcomes for kids.
So as we mobilize God's people to do this, what we're really asking and inviting people into is discipleship and evangelism.
We are.
Right. And so I don't think discipleship and evangelism are all that different.
Agreed.
You are bringing someone along toward Jesus together, and you are still communicating the gospel and the beauty of Jesus and the scriptures together, whether someone is not yet following God or they are. Like, it's the same content. You're working from the same source. And so when you think about big picture discipleship and evangelism, like, they're not two different things. It's kind of like two sides of the same coin.
Agreed.
Are they following Jesus yet, or are they not? So when we think about the ministry that we do here at Christian Heritage, it's not just preaching, teaching, word ministry, right? We're inviting people in to live out following Jesus, model it. You can actually do discipleship and evangelism for a child and a parent without being preachy. And you're going to have the chance to talk about Jesus. You're going to have the chance to share the gospel, because the gospel eventually needs to be spoken. But this is evangelism and discipleship lived out in the context of everyday life, which for the most part is pretty slow, pretty boring, pretty mundane. It's not that exciting. It's not crowds of 50,000 people all, listening to a great sermon or singing together. It's the stuff of life. It's entering into the messiness of life. And that's what Jesus did. And that's what he's calling us to do. That's what we get to invite people into.
Yeah. That's so good. It reminds me of, an article that Jed Medifin wrote. And
he's the CEO of
CEO of Christian Alliance for Orphans. Yep. And one of the things that he wrote in a theology of foster care, which if you get a chance, really highly recommend reading it. But he wrote, children and families involved in the foster care system have tasted the world at its most broken.
Yep.
When we welcome them into our homes and our hearts, we share in that hurt with them. We trust that amidst the trials, we can experience an unparalleled fellowship with Christ. In God, even the very hardest things can be the source of great good in our lives and in others. And so for me, what he's defining is this discipleship in evangelism. And, you and I were talking about this. When we start talking about trauma-informed care, we're talking about, I believe, a new understanding of what we believe about discipleship and evangelism. I really do. I think to really be effective in our culture today, you have to be trauma informed. It's not, maybe I'll get to that someday, or I need to come. No, you need to understand what it means to be trauma informed, because it will heavily influence then what you believe about the gospel and then how you communicate the gospel. I think you, James, do a great job of articulating that in our Becoming a Trauma Responsive trainings that we're beginning to, help come alongside the church and understand or gain a new perspective of what we believe is gospel-centered, that's discipleship focused, and I would say evangelism expressed.
And for those who haven't taken the training, a little taste of it is we talk about helping people to belong before they even believe in Jesus. It's what you do in foster care. It's what you do if you're a host home through our Families Together program. It's what you do if you're a mentor. It's what you do when you bring food or diapers or mow a lawn. You are communicating through your actions and through your words that you belong to my community, even though you maybe don't believe the same things that I believe, even if you don't come to church or you never come to church. And I think sometimes Christian, we just get in this trap where like, man, I'm doing this. I really want them to come to church. I really want them to believe in Jesus. It's like, yes, of course. But if that's why you're doing that, you're really not loving them for them. So welcome them in as Jesus did. He welcomed Judas. Like, think about that. He welcomed him in And we get the privilege. We welcome people in to belong to our community before they even believe, even if they never believe, because that's really between God and them. We just get we get the chance, the privilege to be ambassadors for God. That's what discipleship is. That's what evangelism is. It is really at its core level. And and you think about it as, what does it have to do with trauma? It's entering in. Jesus, oh my gosh, he left a perfect place to come here. Talk about trauma. Jesus experienced trauma by living here.
Yeah.
And he entered into our trauma and he welcomed us. And then he was turned on. He was denied. He was forsaken.
Philippians 2. I mean, this is, it is an absolute living out Philippians 2 or Romans 5. I think we have become blind to, this Romans 5. And we think that, well, Christ died for us while, we were still sinners. There, he did that work before we even understood or would ever accept that work. And I think you're absolutely right. We have created conditions now with that very work of evangelism and discipleship. I think that is a massive blind spot, not for every church, but I think in general, it has become a blind spot. And so you're right. We through Christian heritage and becoming trauma informed is we believe that we are living out Philippians 2, Romans 5 in that regard.
We'll kind of wrap up here.
Yeah, this has been good, man. These are still good, important conversations to have. They really are.
One thing I'll add, or we'll end with, is, that quote I read from Pete Portal. Yeah. I put on Facebook yesterday, and I had a lot of people comment, and you could sense their angst and that they felt this. And it was a wide variety of people, different backgrounds, different experiences, all of them Christians. I know all of them personally. And I made a comment later in the night as I was reflecting on what some people had posted. And I said, this resonates with all of us because we sense it, we feel it, we can see it. But I would be willing to bet most of us, including myself, feel helpless to fix it. We don't know what to do. And I'm saying this as somebody who, again, has served in ministry. My wife and I together, we've had these conversations for years about there's something broken. What do we do about it?
Right.
What was comforting to me was, even if as a collective, we don't know what to do, I'm not alone in feeling this. Roy, you're not alone in feeling this.
Right.
And I just think that shows there's great opportunity for the church right now to say, you know what? The status quo isn't good enough. We just can't keep doing what we've been doing and expect different results. But we've been doing what we've been doing for probably the last 70, 80 years in the church in North America. And it's time for, again, we talk about this in our training, a radical reorientation, where we get the opportunity to think and live differently and really go back to the beginning.
Well, and I think the only way to get there is honestly through repentance. It's humbling ourselves. It's humbling ourselves and really, being open-handed to the things that God is calling us to. And, I think here in the work that we do, and I'm reminded this all the time, James, of the conversations, the stories, the hardships, we are reminded on a daily basis here how broken our world is. And what I love about so many of our staff here is they are the ones literally running into these situations and, feeling that. But that's what I love. What we've got to do, and I feel like this is the work that we're doing, why we do these things, is we want to say that you're not alone in how you're feeling, and there's people who are doing something about it. We're not just complaining. We're not just whining about it. At times, do we feel helpless? Absolutely. But this is why the community connection, God's people, and then watching God show up in the midst of all of that. It's like, he continues to give us the signs we need to stay in the game, to continue to fight the good fight. And that's what we see in scripture is stay in, fight the good fight of faith. And that's what we do. here at Christian Heritage.
It's a good word to end on. We could talk about this for hours, and
I know
maybe
we
we
could.
will. Maybe we'll come back to it again soon.
Always
All
love
right, thanks,
talking with
Roy.
you, bud. Absolutely.
Great conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening.